Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Building Your Permaculture Property. My name's Takota Coen, and today I have Dan Palmer on the episode. Dan, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Takota. Great to be here.
So, Dan, why don't you tell me a bit about yourself, just and kind of share your story about how you got into permaculture.
Sure thing. So, I was from New Zealand. I ended up at university studying psychology and philosophy. Then I was on my way to Reno, Nevada to enter a grad program there, and I stopped in Melbourne, Australia, to did some work along the way. And upshot is I changed my plan, stuck around there, finished a PhD in psychology and philosophy in Melbourne. And as I got done with that, I'd done a few. I was on a track towards being an academic.
Yeah.
And I had an epiphany moment when I was looking at academics 20, 30, 40 years down the track from me and realizing that was not the person I wanted to become. So I ran the hell away from the academy, and ended up in a share house with some lovely folks that were growing veggies in the backyard and using this word permaculture and whatnot. And that was fun. I really enjoyed putting my hands in the earth, and I learned how to bake bread and stuff like that. And somewhere in the mix there, I did a friend had mentioned this thing called permaculture, which seemed to be about organic gardening, and I signed up for a course, more or less expecting a few gardening tips, gardening tips. That was with Bill Mollison and Jeff Lawton in 2005. Oh, and wow. At the time, it rocked my world. One of the reasons it rocked my world is that I had come to the conclusion in my PhD thesis that that modern human culture civilization is underlying its many layers of dysfunction are these massive separations or dichotomies or splits or dualisms or whatever you want to call them between things like mind and body, theory and practice, hand and heart, subject and object, person and world, humans and nature, humans and the rest of life, etc., etc. Long list there. And permaculture seemed to be something about resolving or dissolving that split and being animals, being the animals with quite big brains that we are, but in re-entwining, re-embedding ourselves back into natural ecologies and all that. So I came out of the PDC pretty fired up, and from there, in short order, I went along to a volunteer project in India with my designer's manual and making herb spirals and banana circles and chicken tractors. I left a trail of these things behind me in Kolkata, India. I laugh, but I'm quite embarrassed to admit that looking back. Taking the permaculture grab bag sort of approach and impose clever solutions approach. And then I was involved in starting something called Permablitz, which is a now global movement of people that get together for backyard permaculture makeovers. Oh, cool. And that led to some conversations that in turn led to a permaculture design firm being founded by myself and some friends called Very Edible Gardens, which is about, 13, 14 years old, and continues to this day. And so I found myself in the position of being a professional permaculture designer. And then along the way, after doing it and continuing to do a whole bunch of professional permaculture design work, I started to go back to the ideas and started projects like Making Permaculture Stronger, which is about kind of disruptively regenerating permaculture's own understandings of what it's about and what it's capable of, and avoiding kind of stagnation and just getting sidetracked. Holistic decision making, which is about it's an evolution of Alan Savory's holistic management, about getting focused and making decisions that take you where you want to go, values-based decision making, and something else called living design process, which is an approach to design and creation of anything inspired by Christopher Alexander's work. So that's the sort of stuff I'm playing around with.
Yeah, no. So my first kind of introduction to your work was through a colleague of mine, Javin Bernakovich, with him, and because I had taken my first PDC, and it sounded like it was very similar to yours. It was all kind of gardening tips, and well, I guess no, but it was the exact opposite of yours. I was expecting to get what you got, but I got gardening tips and tricks. And I was really disenfranchised with the whole thing. And, but eventually I found my way back to kind of Bill and Jeff and stuff. And it rocked my world that I started just doing, all the techniques and stuff on our property here. And I made a ton of mistakes. I wasted tens of thousands of dollars, and I was just in a wreck. And then I was taking another course, and my colleague Javin did this session on goal setting, and he borrowed a lot of your stuff, and also talked about unsavories, and he kind of had his own spin on it. But it blew me away. And yeah, for years I used your template of kind of your you had like a little mind web for what your kind of context was. And yeah, it was like it's hard to explain to folks that, like, until you really get into it and you have failures and you can't figure out why your things aren't going the way that you'd expected. There's no point in trying to teach somebody about decision making and knowing kind of what your why is. But for people that have had those, and just a light switched on. So yeah, it's great to finally connect. I had no idea that you started the permablitzes either. That's a new one for me. That's crazy.
Right. Yeah. Not alone, with some lovely friends, but yeah, it was something we made up one day, and it's gained some momentum since then.
Yeah. So there's a lot of directions that a lot of ground I want to cover today, and but I'd like to start with your Making Permaculture Stronger work that you're doing right now, because I think it's really important work, and this is so you've taken a peek through the book that Rob Michaud and I just wrote, and just to kind of give you a bit of context on our end. The book started out with the running title, Adaptive Habitat, a 5-step process, because that was one of the earlier names of it. And we actually didn't have permaculture in the book because we had been kind of distancing ourselves because of just the dogma and kind of the bad taste as a result of some of the other stuff that's out there. But through the process of kind of writing the book again, I kind of fell back in love with permaculture as I was, going back and everything. And about halfway through, I was just like we have to reclaim this word. Like there's so much wisdom and beauty in it, and it's and there are some mistakes as well. But I just wanted to get kind of your take on it. Like why like, what are permaculture's weaknesses right now?
I see that as one of these questions. It's, I don't know, maybe a dangerous question to ask a person like me, Takota, but well, first up, let me reframe the question. The question I would have preferred you to have asked, and the question I'll explore, is where are permaculture's places of greatest potential? So, rather than having the energy of where are the problems or where are the weaknesses, where do I see permaculture as having the potential to take the largest steps towards adding as much value to humanity and Earth as possible, in the future. And there's a lot of, I'm in my mind right now, I'm going from thousands of little directions. I'm just sort of kind of what's underneath those, and if I go far enough, where I arrive is I think permaculture's greatest potential lies in the possibility to collaboratively evolve and share and crash test and develop and improve a understanding of design and creation processes that is fundamentally and radically different from the way the rest of modern civilization works. And the reason I think that's a potential and a not an actual thing is that I'm clear for myself it's so far failed to do that in quite a significant way, in a way that's for me very sobering to really acknowledge and speak honestly about. But at the same time, that's where I think the juice is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I mean, I guess I'm curious to see why are you opposed to talking about like the weaknesses?
Oh, well, yeah, to speak a little bit more about that. So I should acknowledge Carol Sanford's influence on my thinking in the last couple of years. She's a powerful regenerative thinker. And she has this, she has a lot of these things she calls living systems frameworks.
Mhm.
And one of them, there's hundreds of them, one of them she calls levels of paradigm. And I found this an incredibly insightful, profound, precise, and practically useful way of understanding where we're sitting, like the container our mind is centered in, as we kind of, as we see the world, as we ask questions, and as we kind of, as we try and make sense of what it is we're trying to achieve. And the four levels of that framework, at the bottom is value return, which in its shallowest, darkest, or most shadow kind of manifestation becomes extract value, which is the, is the modus operandi of modern neoliberal corporate capitalism, which is just, extract as much value as we can, make as much profit, and sure, there'll be collateral damage, but too bad. And then that paradigm gave rise to the first wave environmentalism, which Carol calls the arrest disorder paradigm. And arrest disorder is all about finding weaknesses, finding issues or crises or problems, and reducing them. So it's about making things less bad. So you start by finding something that's bad, and a weakness is something that you define as bad, and making it less. So it's all about making something go away. And I mean, there's various fundamental issues with that. And when you look back at the history of a lot of activism, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. Anyway, it's possible to, while acknowledging the importance of arresting disorder, and pushing against and doing things about our problems, it's possible to move up. And as you move up, it's not that you move from inherently bad to inherently good paradigms. You just enlarge your capacity to engage with complexity. So you're able to hold more and engage with more and contribute more. And so as you move up from arrest disorder, the next one is do good. And that's where permaculture started, was the idea that Bill Mollison, literally, he was involved in a lot of activist movements and protests, etc. Then he went away to a shack in the woods and he was like, hang on a second, I could spend my whole life fighting against things I don't want. And then David Holmgren, in his own words, had the exact same realization. This is one thing they were totally in resonance on. Or I could do the stuff, I could contribute and live and manifest the positive changes in the world I'd like to see, be the change I want to see, that kind of vibe.
Yeah.
So in the do good paradigm, and I see permaculture is centered in a combination of arrest disorder and do good, it's all about identifying something positive that you can contribute and contributing that. So doing good things. And it's often, there's a sense of there's a kind of a benefactor beneficiary kind of vibe. And the dark side of the do good paradigm is that it requires a definition of good. And usually the definition of good comes from the do gooder. So the person doing good says, this is good, to give goats to African villages, or to tell people to put swales in their backyard or whatever. It's a good idea. And so I'm going to do the good thing of sharing that stuff. And a lot of colonization, and certainly the colonial missionaries were operating from the do-good paradigm. They're literally sharing the good word, and in the process, they were decimating indigenous cultures and multi-thousand-year-old wisdom traditions and all that. So the do-good paradigm is responsible for a lot of bad. And these things are related, right? So like Bill Gates, for example, coming from the extract value, or at least the value return paradigm, has contributed to all this collateral damage, and now he's using a lot of his wealth to try and do good. Which ultimately has downsides, as well as its place in the world. And then you move up to this fourth level, which is regenerate life. And in regenerate life, you leave the idea of arresting disorder, or just simply focusing on correcting weaknesses, making weaknesses less weak, as well as imposing some definition of what you think good is, to developing the skill and the humility and the capacity to engage with something you care about, being a person, a family, an ecosystem, a community, a village, whatever, and support it and resource it to develop itself, to grow its capacity, to evolve its capacity to express itself, and define on it what good is in it on its own terms. So I don't know if you're following me, but you good? Yeah. I'll bring it back to permaculture. Okay, so bringing all that back to permaculture, the reason I'd much rather talk about focusing on permaculture's potential and interventions that can be made to support it, to express it, to develop its potential, rather than what are its weaknesses and how can we reduce the weaknesses, is that at the end of the day, if I was successful in identifying a whole lot of weaknesses permaculture had and spent a whole lot of effort making them go away, at the end of it all, a successful outcome would be kind of nothing. You know, that the things I was focusing on were gone, as opposed to contributing to the growth and evolution of something. And so it's moving from a problem mindset. What are the problems? How am I going to solve the problems? And if you look for problems, you'll find them indefinitely, to a potential mindset, which is what's the potential of the situation and how can I engage with this entity or being in a way that supports it to step into its potential. And they have very, very different outcomes in the world. And that's actually a move that was, it was what defined the move from what I'm calling making permaculture stronger phase 1, which was weakness and problem focused, to making permaculture stronger phase 2, which is potential focused and regenerate life focused, which is about, rather than trying to fix all the superficial issues and weaknesses and problems that are rife in permaculture, as you know, and you very accurately and I think articulately allude to a lot of these in your book. I'm interested in cutting through all that and going back to the core, the essential originating impulse of permaculture, as a radical idea birthed by these people, and then regenerating fresh understandings from there. And part of those fresh understandings for me have to be a completely different understanding of what design process is.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I watched a little intro video on your website, and one of the analogies you gave I really liked, which was this idea that, you know, there's permaculture has really great roots, and it's turned into this kind of massive tree that, you know, has branches that cover the globe, but, you know, there's some kind of black knot, and you know, there's some weaknesses or whatever, problems with the branches, but because of the, you know, the anti-fragile nature of life and permaculture, you get this analogy of kind of cutting it down or coppicing it so that it can kind of sprout back from the root. And I couldn't agree more. And so for me, it's like that kind of four-part framework of paradigms there. That's also how I think. And I was just trying to start at with like kind of the weaknesses, because it's basically if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. But I also have an aversion to talking about problems as well, because it's so easy to get bogged down in the drama and the details and miss so much of the higher value. So like in our you were talking about going from kind of how do we go from this extraction to doing good and all these different phases. We also have a kind of a paradigm framework in our process that we talked about, which was going from how do I get more goods to how do I do less bad to how do I do more good. And I think that our, like, how do we do more good? I also really believe that in order to do that, you have to get past humility was the word that really resonated with me there. Is it's so easy for us to project, like you said, this is what is good, and I know it, and not realize that that we've made terrible mistakes in the name of, it's the road to hell is paved with good good intention.
You know what? I just had to you know what I thought you were going to say? Honestly, I thought you were going to say the road to hell is paved with swales.
Yeah, that's about it, isn't it?
Well, look, the road to heaven may also involve swales. Don't get me wrong.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it's terrible because like swales are one of the techniques, one of the many techniques that actually worked for me. Most of the other ones didn't, but in our context, they work. But and when I tell my stories about how they worked, and like it's amazing, but no matter how often I say it, this may not be the right thing for you. People always say, "Where do I put the swale? Where do I put the swale?"
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they miss that memo. A question for you, Takota, was you talked about how you've got a sound like a somewhat resonant series of paradigms, but it sounded like you stopped at doing good, or was there a layer above that moves into the space of evolving capacity?
That was just kind of our more of like a play on words of kind of getting more goods, like materialism, to doing less bad, and so how do I do more good? But like there's like we also talk a lot about how part of that kind of, in order to improve well-being in the world, it requires us to understand that that humility is actually the best way to accomplish that, and that interdependency and all those, basically all those things that you talked about in the adaptive nature. So we just kind of put those together. But I couldn't agree more with that framework from Carol Stanford. I'm not familiar with her work, but I definitely want to check it out.
I can recommend. I actually interviewed her on the Making Permaculture Stronger podcast, and she took us through these 4 paradigms. Incredibly relevant and powerful. And one last point I'd love to land here is that if you start with weaknesses or problems, you're starting with fragments. You're starting with a siloed, fragmented approach. And to work regeneratively, you need to work with wholes. And like you can't even really grasp what life is and work to enhance and align with life unless you start with wholes. And to start with problems is to start with fragments. So you're starting from a non-regenerative kind of first step, and so you're screwed. You're just not in the game of regeneration. You're in another game. You're in the game of extracting value, arresting disorder, or perhaps doing good, but you're not in the game of regeneration. And I see permaculture as having the potential to resource authentic regeneration. And when I say potential, what I mean by that is I don't think it's by and large doing that yet. It has the potential to do it. And I would feel really sad for that potential to be missed. And it's a weird situation for me, because part of it is just realizing, I don't know, the truth of that. So often we think permaculture is great, and it's mostly, there's a few superficial details, but fundamentally it's okay. Whereas I'm wanting to invite the possibility for collaborative work at a deep level, at the very, very questions that permaculture begins from, sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll bite. What are those questions, or what does starting from wholes rather than fragments look like? And I also realize that you're trying to answer this on your podcast and stuff, but
no, I'll be delighted. I mean, I'm passionate about this stuff. I'm delighted to explore it. Okay, this is going to be fun. So, well, you talked about how I've been using the analogy of a tree, and analogies are always risky. They're true in part and false in part, and it's always important not to get too attached to them. So you're using the analogy of the tree. You don't necessarily have to have something that represents the leaves or whatever. And in this analogy, that's all there. And readers can go and check that out. Our listeners can go and read more about that on the Making Permaculture Stronger site. But so to look at permaculture as a whole, as opposed to a siloed collection of fragments and trying to do something about this bit, this bit, this bit, this bit, you need to go back to its originating impulse, to its where from the place it was sourced. And so I've been sitting with that question: where was it sourced? From what question or conversation did permaculture originate? And in an interview with David Holmgren that was about his journey with permaculture design process, but we talked about what he sees as the seed of what he describes as the seed of the permaculture concept, which he co-originated with Bill Mollison. And that seed was a conversation with Bill Mollison where David was interested in, he discovered a question in the place where landscape architecture, so basically landscape design, and agriculture and ecology overlap. He could see where any two of those overlapped. There was some discipline that was doing something about that. For example, agroecology, where agriculture and ecology overlap, but nothing in the place where all three overlapped. And he was sitting with Bill Mollison saying, "Hey, I'd like to explore this in my graduate thesis next year." Or I don't know, I think it was a graduate thesis. And Bill said, "Well, what about asking how come our agriculture doesn't work like the rest of life, For example, why is it based on monocultures of annuals rather than perennial polycultures? And for David, that was like, wow, that is perfect because it sits in the overlap. And it's a design question where the invitation is, what would it mean to design agricultural ecologies or ecological agricultures? And then from there, so that to me, that's pretty close to the starting point of the permaculture concept. So we've gone back, and so there's no fragments yet, right? That is kind of the kernel or the seed or the acorn of the idea, and from then it started to grow. And to me, it retained wholeness for quite a while before it started to get all sliced up, and we got confused about what was kind of true to permaculture and what had been unwittingly imported from outside and grafted on. That's part of the work I'm trying to do, is discern the difference, because there's a whole lot of baggage that's coming from outside, and some of it we think is core to permaculture when it's actually it's completely unaligned with permaculture. Anyway, where the conversation went next is that the idea of mimicking nature started to be talked about, and there's actually a few deep issues with that already. So to me, there's ways in which I see permaculture as I don't know, missing certain opportunities. I don't know if we'll come back to that, but the idea of nature itself, just that idea and that word, has some real issues, and certainly the idea of mimicking nature has some issues. But in any case, the idea was what would it mean to mimic, forests, the way forests function in agricultures, and what was looked towards was the functional characteristics of healthy ecosystems, and then how could we kind of superimpose or learn from or bring across those functional characteristics into our human created systems, originally agricultural, but then more broadly. And if you look at a lot of the permaculture design principles, choose your list, that's what they are. They are descriptions of the functional characteristics of healthy ecologies, right? Yeah. The thing is, what you're doing there is you're describing characteristics of the outcome of an ecological process, right? Like the forest wasn't there at some point. It grew, it evolved through succession, all that stuff. It arrived at a certain place, and we can go and look at that outcome, and we can describe the functional characteristics of the outcome. And then we can say, how can we replicate those or mimic those in our human created systems? The thing is that to create any outcome, you need a process. And to me, the thing I'm excited about in terms of what I mentioned earlier, in terms of pursuing or supporting the conversation around permaculture's potential, is that the processes we tend to reach for come from the world of machines. We've been brought up with them. They're so kind of deep in our cells now that we can't even see them and pull them out. And there's ideas in there around the dominance of the intellect, around assembling elements to create whole systems, around creating a master plan or a blueprint before you start, about I'm conscious maybe we're getting a little too complex too fast, but I'll finish a line of thought and then we can check in. There's a whole lot of aspects that people think of as native and appropriate to permaculture design process that did not come from the question of how did the forest come into being? What was the process that got from the acorn to the oak tree? What was the process that got from this volcanic plateau after the eruption to the forest 1,000 years later? It's a different question, and it leads us to some pretty interesting places.
So this is something that I've also struggled with myself, and is because I'm fascinated by indigenous cultures and like the books like I just finished Dark Emu actually, and it blew my mind. Like I highly recommend it for folks who haven't read it, but it's like they didn't have GIS systems and LiDAR data and AutoCAD and drone, like this stuff, and yet they figured out how to tap into that process of this is how we mimic nature, or and I agree with you. There's also like and so
can I jump in there? Sorry to jump in, but I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't say they figured out how to tap into that process. I would say they were never not that process. They were never separate from that process.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And this is it's like there's another I can't remember the name of the book right now, but his whole thing was basically how when the premise of this guy's book, maybe I bet you you've read it, was that when we started to write things down, that's when language became separated from place and when communication became impossible. And so like what you were saying is like they were never not part of that process. And it was like it's like this is the danger of or the potential downside of things like, you know, written language and all these tools, is that it's so I also resonate, or I struggle with that, but I've also seen for myself anyways the incredible value in these tools, or the apparent value, at least in the short term, in helping to improve, you know, my own well-being and things like that. So yeah, I'm really curious what what are your solutions to or ideas about how to overcome this kind of progress trap?
Well, I'd probably call it a process trap in the sense that we've fallen out of this, the primordial state of non-separation with the rest of the living world along the way with the Industrial Revolution, and you know, and yeah, the written word and all that's contributed to it. I don't think it's inherently. I don't think we need to stop writing words to do something about this.
No, certainly not. But it's just like it's like the tools have like a life of their own, and there's consequences of using some of them.
Yeah, fully. Hang on, I lost my train of thought here. Ask the question again.
We were talking about how a lot of these concepts that are kind of seen as permaculture, as in, you know, creating like a master plan and you know, using these things, they're actually kind of part of a paradigm that ironically limits us from actually achieving the goal, which was, like you were saying, the core insight of permaculture is and I think the way that Gabe Brown, he's a farmer from North Dakota, I like the way he says it, is that Mother Nature has 3.5 billion years worth of research and development, and we'd be crazy not to tap into that. And so it's like that was the core insight of permaculture. But then, like, there's no you know, Google Earth Pro or drones or technology involved in how nature does it, yet we superimpose that onto it. And so my question was, how do we is it essential that we don't superimpose those tools on? Are there ways that we like alternatives, or is it just being aware of the fact that you know, the map is not the territory kind of stuff? Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, yeah. So I think for me to bring clarity to this conversation, the key distinction is between process and outcome. And so, you know, the rest of life, Mother Earth, has had this very long R&D cycle, and you know, us puny humans thinking we come up with something better and all that, and discovering the delusion of that and how that's fast driving us to self-termination. Yeah. Then leads to the it leads to the question, and I think this is often a missed question, was, okay, it's had this massive R&D cycle, and biomimicry, for example, I think is pretty clearly in this camp. Let's look into what it's created with that massive R&D period, and pick the bits we like and make trains that have fronts shaped like kingfishers and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So what we're trying to do is mimic the outcomes of that process, and permaculture falls into that same pattern. The thing is, though, so, you know, whether you think of it in terms of principles, we want systems that catch and store energy and use edge effect, or we want to, in a more superficial use of permaculture, well, this seems to make sense, so we'll do swales, we'll do herb spirals, whatever. Pretty soon you realize that doesn't work, because you're doing good, or you're trying to do good, but you're creating havoc because you're imposing stuff that didn't originate from the actual situation on the situation. So at some point there's a non-adaptation or a clash. And so you realize you go from an outcome focus back to process. We need some kind of process, right?
Yeah.
Which is what happened in permaculture.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, at that stage, the mechanical understandings of process, which have some of those characteristics I mentioned, very focused on intellectually dominated, understand design as a process of assembling separate parts into wholes, just like you'd play Lego or build a machine. Start with a master plan, which is separated from then implementing it, which is usually done by different people, which is separated from then actually using it, and so on, and various other characteristics. We grab onto those. And the irony is that then we then bring that in to try and generate our permaculture, adapted permaculture systems. But the irony is we're using a process that has nothing to do with that half a million year R&D cycle that Mother Earth, even though we're saying that's what we're about, we're actually basically giving a big FU to Mother Earth by using a process that is completely unaligned. And so the question I'm interested in starting with, rather than how do we mimic the outcomes of these processes and try and create something that looks or functions like a forest, what would it mean? And like I said, I have issues with the word mimic, but that we can come back to that another time. What would it mean to mimic the processes that Mother Earth used to get to these outcomes? And if you ask that question and you stand in the space of that question, some very interesting doorways become open to you. And I've been knocking on some of those doors and taking some very interesting excursions. And it's very radical, which excites me because permaculture is supposed to be radical. You know, it started as a very radical thing. And then to me, it became de-radicalized. And I'm not saying that Bill and David got it perfect and you know, kind of people that followed de-radicalized it. I think that some of the de-radicalization actually happened in some of the decisions they made. You know, they're both mortals, whatever. A lot of these ideas are so deep, it's hard to even see them.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in going back and in a way, participating in that conversation that they were having in the early days and helping notice some of the missteps. And I mean, I'm so excited with the fact that at least David is still alive and I'm literally able to participate in those conversations with him, which he's excited about also.
Absolutely. So I don't know, did the quote in our book from the Canadian architect, his name is Bruce Mao, did that pop out at you? Have you heard that one before?
I don't think I've seen that. I've done a quick scan and I'm just going through more thoroughly now.
Okay,
so,
no worries.
Yeah.
So he has this quote, which basically this quote was which kind of summarized everything you just said, and this was what got Rob, Michelle, and I kind of started on also trying to come up with some kind of a process. And so his quote is this: that process is more important than outcome. When outcome drives the process, we can only go to where we've already been. But when process drives when process is the driver, we might not know where we're going, but we'll know we want to be there. And so like for what you're saying now is like how the forest came out of nothing, and that process, like that's where we want to go. But it's these kind of shiny little outcomes that we get sidetracked by, and it's very nuanced. But
yeah, well, can I just jump in there?
Yeah,
well, one nuance there is it's not that the process Mother Earth used to come up with the concept tree, let's say.
Yes.
It's not that the process is where we want to go. The process is the thing we want to align with and be, you know, in the sense that to me, to be authentically human is to kind of be that process. That's the thing we want to use to get to wherever it is we want to go, which the quote so beautifully points out about it becomes an unknown.
Yeah.
And there's a related quote I love about a life fully lived as a free fall, a continuous free fall into the unknown. But you actually start to develop a deep enough process literacy and process understanding. And to me, this is a multi-generational process that you can lean into and trust the process and let the outcomes be what they may, which is very hard to do. It's so hard for our minds not to be hijacked by images and ideas and, oh, it's too hard. It's too much unknown. Let's just shove some swales in.
Yeah, I agree. And so like so many of the, and this is my greatest fear of any of the work that I've done with my colleagues is that people are going to take our attempt to talk about this very thing, and they're going to use it as a process, and they're going to use it as a prescription. You know, it's just this and this and this.
It's a huge and potentially a unavoidable risk.
Yeah. So yeah, this is also my life's work as well, and I'm thrilled to have found a fellow because there's very few of us that can have multiple hour-long conversations about this kind of stuff. But and so now I'm also aware, because I've had a lot of these conversations like where there's 2 or 3 people that are like in it, and then the group around is just like falling asleep.
Yeah. What the hell are they talking about?
So do you have any you mentioned that you're kind of knocking on some of these doors and you're having really exciting outcomes. Can we bring this kind of high level conversation that we've just had and bring it into something tangible, or an example, or a story that you could share?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what does this mean on the ground? And to me, it means a radically different process with radically different outcomes. And so, I started knocking on the doors 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, in a sense. So yeah, some of the doors are a fair way behind me. There's still lots of doors and pathways ahead. But so one example would be, I'll choose one that I know resonates with something that you shared in your book. One example is moving from the do-good paradigm-centered idea of me as the permaculture expert design consultant who's going to do the good thing of telling you what to do with your life and where to pull stuff in your property, and this is how your life and property is going to be for the next 20 years. Moving from that whole frame to the frame of I'm going to be a developmental resource, an educator, and support you to grow and evolve and be in control of your own process.
Yes.
And then within the dynamics of that, the question is, rather than starting with, here's a real simple one. I think anyone can grasp this. I think it's very simple and very clear. It's very hard not to fall into the deep rut and trap when you read permaculture books and learn about permaculture, and when you've been brought up in this civilization, to think at a very fundamentally deep level that design is a process of identifying separate elements and assembling them to create a whole system. And there's aspects of this that I know you touched on in the book, which I was really grateful to see. This becomes almost impossible to avoid when you've done your permaculture course, read a permaculture book or 3. You're sitting in front of some actual clients and you say, how can I help? What do you want? And they say, wow, what do we want? We want a chicken house. We want a pond. We want a house. We want a driveway. They give you a list of elements.
Yes.
And so how the hell is your job not to assemble elements?
Yeah.
So you've got to have quite a lot of discernment and consciousness, I think, to avoid the trap there. Because I'm telling you, and you probably already know this, it's a deep trap. Because what you will end up, if you proceed from that point, is you will end up with an assemblage of elements, which will be a gangly kind of mechanical thing that doesn't really fit and belong, and doesn't really belong in the rest of life.
Yeah.
And so when we ask what some of this stuff we were going into before that, like you say, might just not really be hard for others to connect with, what does that mean practically? It means at this stage, and this resonates with a bunch of what, it's funny, actually, we're talking, I'm realizing there's perhaps more, there's more commonalities than I realized between where you've ended up at the stage and where I've ended up, is going back to the core, to engaging with these people as a whole and say, let's park the elements for a little bit. Let's come back to who you are uniquely, and what it is you're aspiring towards uniquely, and let's put something together there. Yeah. And I consciously steer away from words like mission and vision and other stuff. Yeah. But one way or another, help someone articulate a context and do some real hard work there. And then you've got a seed, then you've got some DNA that you can then use to grow a process and the outcomes of the process in turn that remain whole, rather than defaulting to all these fragments that you then stick together, chuck on a pretty picture master plan, sell it, move on to the next client, and just leave this legacy of the same old shit under a different banner. It's like it's permaculture because there's a permaculture label at the top. It's just the same old mechanical design process that's killing the planet.
Yeah.
To me, that is a deep tragedy. So hopefully that's clear. But I should continue to say, because you've still got that list of stuff, right? But now we come back to the list, and rather than seeing them as a list of separate things our job is to assemble, we can engage with that list and kind of interrogate it in a different way.
Yes.
And the way I see it is, rather than seeing it as a list of cogs and conveyor belts and bolts and stuff, your job is to click together like a machine, which was so natively, it's become native for us to think of design that way. Mm-hmm. Whenever someone says, I want a chicken house, it's like they're opening a door on an advent calendar, and behind that calendar is a hole. It's right now, it's very vague to me. It's a whole that I'm helping to birth and bring into being. But when they say we want chickens, they're opening a little door and they're giving me a little window into what that whole might look and feel like, and so on as they list the other stuff. And I can work with that without even needing to have this, slice things to bits. And then I can draw out and develop the whole over time, where the outcomes you arrive at are just off the charts. So much more alive and vibrant and adapted.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree. It's like, so one of my favorite questions to ask clients when they say, or actually I don't really have, like, when I say clients, these are like private students. Like, all I have is people that I'm working with, because like our model is like, the best person to design your land is you, because I also went through the whole kind of phase where we were designing master plans for people and then giving them this 300-page report, and it didn't work. And it cost way too much money, and like, we were learning way more about their property than they were ever going to know. And then at the end of it, we had to like teach them all this stuff anyway, so it was just like that doesn't work.
I've spoken to so many people. Can I just throw one piece in there?
Go ahead.
Just as you're saying that, what I realized was I disagree, because what I would say is, currently the best person to design your place is not me, and currently the best person to design your place is not you. However, I can support you to become the best person to design your place. Because the thing is, people will straight away default to the dead mechanical processes, because that's what we've been brought up with. So I see my job as actually resource and educate people in a different kind of process, a living process that generates authentically living outcomes. And that's I never thought of it but in a way I'm helping evolve them towards earning the reality of the statement, you are now the best person to design your place.
No, that's totally it. And so like, but actually ties perfectly with like this question that we asked, because inevitably we get a list. I want a chicken house. I want a solar greenhouse. I want a pond here. I want ducks. I want a dairy cow. And our first stage of our process, and I also want to acknowledge that, like, it's like, when we're talking about this adaptive kind of living process, it's so difficult. Like, we really struggle do we call them like steps, because it gives us this illusion of simplicity and stuff like that. But we were consciously trying to find the middle ground between like the conversation that you and I are having, that's where it's super dynamic, but also where people are at, and making it something that was accessible, that they could, okay, I can do this. It's like, it's just one step, but then by the end of it, it's like, by the way, the steps never stop. and it's, like you said, it's falling through those, what was that quote? The falling through.
Life is, or you could say a living process is a process of continuously free falling into the unknown. I'll just say quickly too, I've been doing some thinking, prompted in part by the use of your use of the word steps in the book, about this idea of steps as an analogy. And I have some fairly deep critiques of the way steps are usually used to describe a sequence of activities within a permaculture design process.
And I'm super excited to hear have that conversation, but we'll save that for another.
Sure.
Because I really do. I'd love for you to get through the book and see it in full. But coming back to this idea of like the checklist, and I agree. It's like, as soon as you go into that, I call it the what over the why mistake. It's like they're focusing on these specific things, but they're not asking, what is it about chickens that brings you, increases your well-being? What is it about, swales, or whatever the element is? And as soon as you ask that question, it's like, well, I want chickens because I want to have food security. Or I want to have a greenhouse because I want a place that I can go in the wintertime, or what? And then it's like, okay, well, that's the bigger piece. And it's like, and what is it about that? And you kind of keep asking these questions until you get to the end, and they get goosebumps, or they start to cry. And it's like, that's it. That's what you want. And, exactly. And it's the most powerful thing and I've had some like deeply moving experiences with clients. And it's like, that's what permaculture is. Yeah.
Sometimes I explain to others interested in this stuff that, to me, the phase of, or whatever you want to call it, the activity, let's say, of engaging with the clients and you're trying to navigate from what to why. It starts when the tears start dropping.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we've started now. We've
Yeah.
started now. We're there. And I wouldn't say I ever get to the end, but you certainly cross the line where you're out of what space, you're in why space, and why space is often cry space. Sorry, I'm a dad.
No,
Jokes.
I don't have kids, but I make enough jokes that you'd think I had 5 or 6 of them.
You're preparing yourself. Yeah.
So that I think we've I know we only want to go for an hour tonight, and I'm really happy with the ground that we covered, and I think this is I hope this is one of many conversations that we can have in the future, because like you, I see that core question of like in the book, I don't know when I had this insight, but it was I was super depressed, and I was reading this this new kind of study about the sixth mass extinction on planet Earth right now. And it was like, and how humans are basically the root cause of it. And I was like, it just crushed me. But then I don't know, some voice in the back of my head was just like, actually, that's the most exciting thing ever, for 2 reasons. And it's like, well, first, because the planet's has like at least 50% of all life has been wiped out at least 5 times in the past, and it keeps coming back. And it's like, holy crap. Like, and in some cases it was like 95% of the life went extinct. And then the second piece is like, we are just as powerful as the asteroids and, you know, coronal mass ejections and pole reversals and comets and all those other things that wiped half of life. And it's like, and yet we are going head to head with this like incredibly powerful force in the universe, whether you call it, you know, God or the Great Spirit or physics or the Force or one or whatever. There's some force that wants to create something rather than nothing. And if we stopped fighting that thing and as we're talking about, like, became like, I don't know, our language doesn't even have words, because they're all like, you know, even Bill Mawson's definition of permaculture, which is this, it's a system of working with rather than against nature. And it's like that statement, as Penny Livingston Stark pointed out, was like, yeah, it's like, but that statement still has the division of us and nature. We're working with nature. She's over here. It's a really challenging topic, but if we can crack this nut, like it's falling through, you know, all these different levels of abundance that we had no idea were possible.
Beautiful. Yeah, I got a lot of resonance during the conversation, but what you just said there really got me. and that's really what I'm on about with these questions I'm asking.
Yeah.
And what I'm exploring is the possibility that we can actually relax, get over ourselves, and become conscious and discerning enough to let go of some of the baggage in terms of the process baggage.
Yeah.
To fall back into the rest of life as evolution, you know, as we can not partner with or mimic this creative force, but we can be the unseparate creative force that we always were, you know, and then it becomes, it's not, you know, I started as a permaculture design consultant and I went to yoga retreats and meditation retreats for that stuff, you know, but now it's all part and parcel, because there's nothing more, in my experience, there's just nothing that brings me more alive, you know, nothing that feeds and nourishes me and connects me all the rest than this kind of work. It's so much more than a profession.
Well, it's funny, just as you were talking about like the yoga, because I used to do yoga and stuff too, and I don't anymore because I don't feel the need, but it was the word you used of like this idea of like of oneness, where like there is no separation between, you know, nature and us anymore. And the last couple of years, kind of since I started to get this, I've had these moments when I'm on my farm and I'm working with my animals and like like thinking about these systems, and like I'm still involved in design and all that stuff, but I'm no longer thinking about me and there's no longer a separation of elements, and it's freaky when you get to that place where it's like,
yeah.
There's a quote by a physicist, Nassim Haramein, and he says, "I am the universe learning about itself." And it's like that's for me is that feeling of being everything is an indicator. It's like, that's what the process is.
yeah. Those are the kinds of, I think it's possible to do in language, including English, and those kind of quotes do it, right? Does it?
Yeah.
As soon as you're using the word nature, between, mimic, connect, relate, interact, all that, you're starting from fragments. You're not going to get back to the whole.
Yeah. Well, man, I wish we'd scheduled more time. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And if you'll come back on, I would love to have you back on so we can further this discussion, because I also think this is, if we don't continue to ask this question and have this conversation, nothing else matters, in my opinion.
No, well, and I genuinely believe if not necessarily us, but if people within permaculture are not having this kind of conversation, permaculture will stagnate and die. In fact, I'd go further than that. I'd say permaculture is already stagnating and dying, which should be a real shame.
Yes.
For its relevance and contribution to humanity and Earth to be overlooked, because it wasn't able to be true to itself and keep evolving. Hey, maybe to finish, I'll just share, I've had a few of those moments, those glimpses, those moments where I basically forget that I'm separate. I forget the illusion that I'm separate, and it's pretty trippy, right? It's just like, whoa, I had one, I'd done a course exploring this, and I was in a kayak afterwards, and me and the waves, and anyway, but I recalled Bill Mollison, who I did my PDC with, talking about something similar, where he said he'd spent so long in the bush that he looked into he came to get a drink, and he was wash his face or something. He was looking into the water in a pool in the creek in the forest, and he got a shock when he saw himself, and he realized that he'd forgotten that he existed. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh, that's I can relate to that. Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as you're talking about just being in the zone with the animals and all that.
Yeah.
All right, I'd really love to. Why not? We can alternate or whatever. It'd be fun to get you on the conversation on my podcast as well. And I'm really happy to give oxygen and airtime to these matters, and also to show. And I love that you're doing that, to show that you're not just a kind of an armchair philosopher to ask these questions. That it's very possible, and it's imperative, I think, that it's shown how they very richly and directly inform practice, and the idea that whenever you do anything practical, you are deploying paradigms and worldviews and theories and ideas, and unless you do the work of checking those out and cleaning them up and constantly regenerating them, you're just going to be perpetuating the same old crap that's been perpetuated forever. And you're not, it doesn't matter what you're telling yourself, you're not really part of the solution or a solution.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so, and this is why I'm like genuinely thrilled to hear, what your feedback is from the book. And if there's any, so don't hold back, because one of my philosophies is you're never right. You're only less wrong.
Yeah. Well, great to hear it. Cause I was actually sitting with where I take it. Cause I was like, because there's a lot of positive things I'd have to say. And then a lot of, really fun, disruptive, critical things I'd have to say. And I was thinking, are those two separate pieces, or do I somehow combine them? And I also wanted to feel you both out. And I mentioned this to Rob and Michelle too, because I don't want to come in uninvited, and I don't want to bring any, negative critical energy. I only want it to be inside a regenerative field.
Yeah. Of,
hey, we're all learning here, and let's crash test each other's ideas. And if the invitation is there, I could very happily. I could roll through even the first chapter of the book and share a lot of thoughts. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll schedule that, and I can't wait to hear more about it. And I'm gonna I guess, like, what are this is for me as well as the audience. What are some resources that you'd recommend if folks found this? if you're not asleep yet, and you also realize the critical importance of this question and conversation, where should folks kind of go to dive in more? Obviously, your website, making permaculture stronger. Anything else?
for now, that's the main one, making permaculturestronger.net. But this year I'll be putting more energy into designingforlife.org, which is probably going to be the kind of the umbrella for this stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, Dan, thank you so much. I'm sad that we didn't connect sooner, but I'm looking forward to future conversations, man.
Likewise, yeah, a real privilege and pleasure to be in conversation with you. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, take care.
You too. See ya.